Alright, so we are at the end. Thank goodness. Okay, so transitioning into the book for week 5, we are looking at our last novel here, which is The Dewbreaker by Danticat. She's one of my all-time favorite writers. She's my age actually. She's just a few months older than me, but she does keep producing lots of novels. She hasn't stopped writing by any means. So the our last island, or our last week, we looked at this island actually with the Dominican Republic. When I was talking about the Dominican Republic last week, I mentioned how, it's one island, so they do have a shared history. And originally it is colonized by Christopher Columbus and the Spanish, but on what is now Haiti, on that Haitian side, it became populated with French pirates. And I think originally they didn't even start off as pirates. I think they were escaped indentured servants or escaped privateers, or people just, I don't know. The Americas are filled with all these stories of people who just do not want to live under any kind of authority. And they're not necessarily criminals, they just don't really like the system. And so initially I think they were called buccaneers. This comes from how they captured wild cattle and barbecued them, and it was called boucan, so buccaneers. They started out kind of just these bands of people living, I guess we'd say, off the grid now. And they evolved into piracy and criminal activities like that. And so they were a big presence in this half of the island, and the Spanish would put them down and they would come back, and then they had bases, and I think Tortuga, which was British. The British would put them down and they would come back, and then I think finally the British tried to take over this part of the island because the pirates really were a nuisance. I mean, the Spanish and the British, the Spanish are getting just billions of dollars of silver out of the Americas, and this is what the pirates are looting as they're trying to carry it back over across the Atlantic. Although in the pirates' defense, I would maintain that the Spanish took this silver as state-sanctioned theft. That's a whole other different story, a whole different other class I could teach. All of these people who pass themselves off as legitimate are just state-sanctioned pirates, basically. So anyways, both the British and the Spanish have a vested interest in putting down these pirates, and the British eventually put some French guy in charge, which seems like terrible decision-making, but things are just kind of really the Wild West in the Caribbean at this point in its history. And so that part of the island ends up becoming French, because of course this French guy does not like the British. They still don't really like each other, and takes over that part of the island, and they manage to fight off the Spanish, and the Spanish are finally like, oh, let's just not deal with this. And I think, as I mentioned before, they lost that half in one of those treaties. So there is Haiti. That is the background to Haiti, is this pirate refuge. And after it becomes legitimately part of France, the pirates become plantation owners. So immensely profitable plantations are set up in Haiti. At one point, Haiti, I think it's called the Pearl of the West Indies. It is bringing in just millions and millions of dollars for the French. It was providing 40% of the sugar in Europe, 60% of the coffee. The plantations there were exceptionally brutal. They had to import or capture and enslave 40,000 people a year, and that's because they were working them to death, and they weren't living long enough to be more useful past a few years, and they weren't living long enough to reproduce either. So it was just an absolutely, no plantation is good, but this was truly absolutely one of the most brutal places to be sent as a slave. And so I think another effect of this is that the slaves were they're constantly, being tortured and killed and beaten and all of that, but this African presence is much more continuous in Haiti because new people from Africa are constantly coming over, and by the time there is the slave rebellion, which is at the time of the French Revolution in 1798, some of the leaders of that revolution, they had been born in Africa, and so that's a much different dynamic than you might find in the other colonies. And I think from what I've read of slave rebellions, the more successful ones were led by men and women who had recently come from Africa, and so perhaps they weren't, I don't know, they were more rebellious because of that, or whatnot. And also they're looking for, I don't know, sturdy, able-bodied people to do this work, and those are also people who are good at things like, fighting. So at the time of the French Revolution, there's all this talk about liberty, equality, fraternity, and the enslaved people in Haiti took this to heart and led an insurrection. This is the only successful slave rebellion in the Americas, and Haiti is one of the oldest republics in the Americas, I think just following the United States. They become a republic in 1804, and they are a black republic. They are a predominantly African-American republic. And this really freaked people out. This really freaked people out in the United States because, hello, we have a huge slave population as well. No one likes being enslaved. What would happen if all the oppressed peoples of the United States decided to stage a rebellion? So no one really liked what was happening in Haiti, even though, you know, to us today it seems like a really positive thing that people fight for their freedom and independence and the right not to be tortured and killed. So, I mean, there's documentation here with Thomas Jefferson and other people in the government just being really nervous about, you know, this spirit of rebellion spreading and so on and so forth. And I think it's also really important to remember that in the United States at this time, the United States is not predominantly white. We're used to thinking of, I mean, this is going to change within my daughter's lifetime, but we're used to thinking of the United States as population-wise predominantly white. This doesn't really happen until about the mid to late 19th century. So at the time of Haiti's rebellion, we had similar sorts of situations in the United States where, you know, the white Caucasian population was outnumbered, and so it might have been possible for there to have been a successful slave rebellion. So that is one offshoot that happens because of this Haitian Revolution. People get very nervous about it, and because they're nervous about it, they go along with France in some really harsh economic repercussions. And you know, the revolution happened over a period of time. The Haitian forces eventually even had to defeat Napoleon and his forces, so, you know, this went on for years. And France decided, okay, you have your independence, but, you know, now you've taken our land and you've freed our slaves, and now you owe us a ton of money, which, to me, it's just sticks in my craw. It is just morally reprehensible that, I don't know, slavery was legal, so I suppose that's where, you know, lawyers sometimes in the law and politics just make me sick. But they imposed these economic sanctions on Haiti that were quite punitive, that went on, I think, for most of the 19th century, and were kind of economically crippling. So, yeah, I guess that's how to further enslave and oppress people, is to do this economic stuff. So that's one aspect of what happens to Haiti, and it's very hard for them to get established after this. The 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, there's just civil wars back and forth. There are issues with the Dominican Republic, as I mentioned. Then the second half of the 19th century, from 1859 to 1911, there's a lot of stability. Unfortunately, in 1911, another civil war breaks out. By this point, there's a big German population in Haiti. They've gone there for economic reasons, and this is making the United States nervous. Of course, this is the build-up to World War I. And so the United States actually occupies Haiti from 1915 to 1934. And you might see references to this in the Dew Breaker. You certainly see references to this in other Danticat novels. After the U.S. leaves, there's some more instability until finally a man named Francois Duvalier takes office in 1957. And I think he takes office, he's elected and becomes president, and then eventually becomes the dictator until 1971. He is called Papa Doc. And this is because he actually was a medical doctor. He had been the Minister of Health before he became the president. But like a lot of dictators, he was oppressive and cruel, and he did not hesitate from using voodoo to kind of enhance his terror, his power, etc. And this is unfortunate because, you know, most people don't really practice voodoo. Most people are just ordinary Christian people, Catholic in Haiti. But he takes this to sort of capitalize on the superstition and the terror and those aspects of voodoo. While he is the dictator, he creates this paramilitary force, and this is what the Dew Breaker is about a man who is in this paramilitary force. Papa Doc becomes convinced that someone's going to overthrow him, which I suppose it might have been paranoia, it might have been true, and he creates what he calls the Tonton Macoutes, and you'll see this referred to in the Danticat, Tonton Macoutes. And Tonton Macoute comes from Haitian Creole, and it's a voodoo, I don't know, bad guy, a voodoo boogeyman, like from a children's story. And he, if you're not a good kid, then he will come and kidnap you and put you in a sack and take you away. So this is, you know, like a lot of children's stuff. It's just horrific and terrifying. We've been watching a lot of Disney movies this summer, and there's so many that start out with like the deaths of the parents or the whole genocide of the family. I mean, it's traumatizing stuff we give our students. So anyway, this is just to say that it's not just voodoo. We have all these terrible things happening in children's stories. So, and the boogeyman, yes, he kidnaps children in a sack, carries them off, and then I think he eventually eats them. So this is horrifying, and Papa Doc takes this figure from voodoo culture and creates a paramilitary group, and he gets rid of the army, he gets rid of the police, he gets rid of what we would recognize as kind of normal law enforcement, and instead he has this paramilitary group that basically do whatever he wants. This is just a reign of terror for the people of Haiti. The Tonton Macoutes can take you and murder you, they can beat you, they use rape as a weapon of terror and oppression. I mean, thousands and thousands of women are raped, and it's just horrifying. There are estimates that probably 30,000 people are killed under Papa Doc's rule. And so, you know, the lead character here, the do-breaker, this is what he is. He's a Tonton Macoute. And Danticat she's dealing with this just very traumatic aspect of Haitian history. And I think she's doing it in a way to sort of get people to face this, and how do we reconcile ourselves to the reality of this past? Because as I've said before, it's extremely difficult as a people, a nation, a culture to grapple with these things. And so how do we all live together, and how do we all move forward? These are very profound questions, I think. Eventually Papa Doc dies in 1971, and lucky, you know, being sarcastic here, luckily for the people of Haiti, he has a son, Jean-Claude, who takes over and rules until 1986, when there is finally a coup. Both Papa Doc, and I think his son is called Baby Doc, they, in addition to terrorizing the population of Haiti, they're kleptocrats. I think that's what's called when you pillage your country's money and resources into your own private accounts. So, yay. This is just not a fun history. What you'll also see in the Do-Breaker is moving forward in history in the 80s and the 90s. I think when is this published? The early 2000s, I think. I wrote it down. Yeah, 2005. Moving into the 90s, a former priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, is elected in 90. There's a coup. Then there's a period of military rule during which another 3,000 to 5,000 people are killed. This is from 1991 to 1994, and if you remember, this is also a period when a lot of Haitians were getting onto makeshift boats and trying to make it to the United States. I've got a little map here, and I remember this very distinctly because I had a friend in the Coast Guard, and he was stationed down here, and they were rescuing these people, and he said it was just absolutely heartbreaking what was going on. So here's Haiti, and then Florida. It's not as close to Florida as Cuba, but Haitian people, I mean, you know, a lot of it was leave or you're going to die. And so they would risk their lives in these rickety rafts trying to get to Florida. Of course, there are sharks and whatnot. And Danticat wrote a beautiful short story. It's called Children of the Sea, and it's told from two different points of view, and one is a young man who is a political dissident and gets on one of these rafts, and what happens to him and the other people on the raft, and it's just really, really heartbreaking. So that's what's going on in the early 90s. Eventually Aristide is brought back, and you'll see references to this, I think, in some of the stories in the Do-Breaker about the president going and coming back, etc., and celebrations, and that's what it's talking about. Is Aristide's elected, then there's a coup, then he comes back, and then eventually there's a new president, I think in 96. So that is the sort of the background here. Hopefully that will help you understand a little bit about Haiti and the context for our novel, or the stories that are in novel form. That might be a question that you grapple with for the discussion board, is if this is a novel or not. So, Edwidge Danticat, she is our writer for the week. She is someone who I just immensely admire, not just as an artist and a writer, but she's just a person of immense compassion and empathy and integrity. And she's just, I think I'm getting a little weepy here. I think when I read her writing and what she's trying to get us to do as readers, I feel like she is in fact trying to get me to be a more compassionate, empathetic person. And I think that's just a good goal in life. It would be easy to come out of this background of just trauma bitter or angry or resentful, and she's not. I mean, she's just such a, I don't know, not a saint, but she's just very a unique writer. I love her work. She's born in Port-au-Prince in 1969, and when she's only 2 years old, she has a brother at this time, when she's only 2 years old, her father leaves to go to the United States because he has no future in Haiti. When she's 4 years old, her mother leaves to join her father in the United States, and they are left with a very loving aunt and uncle, just extraordinary people who couldn't have children of their own. I think they had adopted a daughter, and so Edwidge and her brother are left with them, and I think she only sees her parents one more time before she's 12 years old. And she has a memoir called Brother, I'm Dying, and the memoir is mainly about her father and her uncle, and you know, the sacrifices her parents have made, and then the sacrifices her uncle and aunt have made, and it's just the most beautiful family memoir I think I've ever read. Most family memoirs are about dysfunction, and this is about just the triumph of this family, and just what, I don't know, they're just good people. It's just kind of neat to read. But in this, Edwidge, she's writing about how she's growing up, and she just has letters she exchanges with her parents, and phone calls in the 1970s are extraordinarily expensive, and these are not people who can afford them, nor do they really have a phone. And she just, she is left with her uncle and aunt, and there is this tradition of the extended family in Caribbean culture. It's not as nuclear based as our own culture, and she just never complains, never is bitter or resentful that her parents did this. She's just very empathetic. She understands why they had to do it, and when she's finally reunited with them in Brooklyn, they've had more children, these other brothers, I think 2 or 3 more brothers, and she's never met these guys, and they've actually lived with her parents longer, and it's just this very interesting dynamic, and it just, I don't know, you see things from her point of view, but she's never asking you to, I don't know, pity her or anything like that, etc. So she ends up in Brooklyn when she's 12, and she'd actually started writing when she was 9 years old, writing stories, and she had if you read Brother, I'm Dying, there's the grandmother figure who's the storyteller, and I think there's a storytelling culture. She went to Barnard, got her BA in French literature, and then she went to Brown and got an MFA in creative writing in 1993. Her thesis for her master's she turned into a book. Voila, because she's a genius. In 1994, it's called Breath, Eyes, Memory. It's a beautiful book. It's about a woman who has been raped by these Tonton Macoutes and has a child, and she's immigrated, and how they cope with this. And that, Oprah still had her original book club then, and that book was chosen for that, and so that got her a lot of attention. It is a beautiful book. As I said before, Danticat is a great literary writer as well as someone who crosses over into the general audience or popular reading. She wrote a book of short stories called Crick Crack, that one that was nominated for the National Book Award. In 1999, Farming of Bones, which is about the Dominican genocide of Haitians, won the American Book Award. 2005, The Dewbreaker won a Story Prize, and in 2007, that memoir I told you about was published, and it was nominated for the National Book Award, and it actually won the National Book Critic Circle Award. So she's just very prolific with writing mainly novels and stories. She's written that memoir. She writes a lot of essays about Haiti. After the earthquake a few years ago, she wrote an essay. She's very involved with Haiti still and with the Haitian American public. She's been writing children's books as well recently. She does live in Miami, and she has 2 children of her own. So, and I think I'm going to get to actually go to a conference, a small conference, where she's the keynote speaker. I just found out this conference I go to every year in Savannah is having her as their keynote speaker, and I about lost it. It's kind of like, rock star. I get to meet my idol. So, to think about something I'm going to present for that conference. So here with the Dew Breaker, a reason why I picked this book is because it does have a lot of the experimental stylistic things. We've got, is it a novel or is it short stories that are all linked up? I don't know. Y'all can decide for yourselves. We certainly do have the linking things of Ka's family, her parents' stories, her story as well, and those are kind of the dominant things. And then, of course, we have stories about the victims of her father who have survived, and then just other stories about Haiti that tie back in. So one question here is, is it a short story collection or is it a novel? And then also, is she telling us this fragmented narrative? Is the narrative fragmented and broken up because it's representative of Haiti's kind of traumatized history? A trend now in literature, especially post-colonial literature or African-American literature, is bringing trauma studies into this literature and looking at the ways in which oppression and violence have traumatized people and bringing in elements of psychotherapy from that. And I've done some reading into this because it's very fascinating. If you look into how victims learn to reconstruct their stories in therapy or something similar to that, they often don't remember them as this cohesive narrative whole. Oftentimes the event can be completely blocked because it's so awful, and if the person is trying to reconstruct it or bring it back, it happens in kind of fragments and bits and pieces, and they may never be able to reconstruct it and to give it kind of a whole shape. And so that's just kind of the nature of the human memory and how we deal with trauma and try to process it. And so that's a lot of what trauma studies is bringing into the study of narrative, and how narrative, I don't know, might try to recreate that fragmentation, or is it giving it too much of a false structure and shape and whole? So let's see. Another question too, of course, and we looked at this with the Alvarez novel, is what happens when a novel is representing something that is very violent and traumatic? There's this mistakes art can make. It can misrepresent it. It can make it too much of an artwork. It can use metaphor to I don't know. It might not be appropriate. So I think we want to think about these things. Is how is Danticat representing this very traumatic history, and how is she? I don't know, how might she be trying to help the Haitian American reader, because she's writing in English, so she's writing for an English reading audience at least. How might these stories be, I don't know, helping the culture, the society, the nation process this trauma or live with it or understand it? And because the thing is, as you'll see in the book, is that everyone has to live together, even the victims and the victimizers. How do you all end up living together? How do you learn to forgive one another? Are there limits to forgiveness and compassion? And if you search in every religion, ideally no. There is not a limit to forgiveness and compassion. Obviously, God's compassion is infinite and so forth, but as humans, we're called upon to strive for compassion and forgiveness. Well, when you have been tortured, or your family members have been tortured and killed, or your sister or your wife or your mother has been raped, I mean, how far do you go? What are these limits? And I think that the Danticat book does a really good job of using families and family relationships to stand in as this metaphor for the nation. And Becca, you talked about this with Day Day and the sisters in the Time of the Butterflies, and how you looked at how the sisters all had different reasons for getting involved in the revolution, and how this really kind of shows us that people as a whole don't get into the revolution for the same reason. It shows us how diverse any group of people can be, and it gets us away from that homogenous stereotype we were talking about at the beginning of the semester. And I think a similar thing is going on here in terms of the family the Mirabal family as a metaphor for the nation, a metaphor for the revolution, and these families here, these people, as kind of a metaphor for the nation. How do you end up living together, and particularly Ka's parents and herself, and what do you do when you find out that your father has a secret past? I mean, this is an extremely difficult thing to deal with, but I think this really plays into post-colonial literature, post-colonial histories, and I think, Kayla, you mentioned this in your post last week, that a lot of post-colonial societies, after they have been exploited and ruled by the colonizer, they have a really hard time establishing a fair and equitable society, and so you do have these situations with dictators, with kleptocrats, continuing the exploitation and oppression, and this is a lot of what Danticat is writing about. And you can decide for yourself if you agree with Fulani, if we're comfortable with this because it's black people abusing black people and we don't see the white oppression here, or the involvement of the United States in facilitating Haiti's problems. But at any rate, this is the reality of what's going on in Haiti, and she is, in fact, trying to deal with it. So, yeah, so just thinking about forgiveness, redemption on a personal level, on a national level, you know, how do we get there? How do we move beyond this? Let's see, and yeah, and I think too, as we're reading along, there's, you know, the do-breaker, who's this title character. He's the torturer. He's the big crime, but there are also smaller crimes and smaller betrayals within there. And is it easier to forgive the small things than to forgive the big things? And I think Danticat does explain why they're called the do-breaker, because they usually arrive to kidnap you or abuse you early in the morning, so you're walking over the dew. And it's a nice, jarring juxtaposition of the beautiful dew and the horrible violence. So, let's see here. So there's all of those things going on with Haiti and its history, representing these traumatic historical events, and compassion, understanding, forgiveness, etc. I'd also like for y'all to keep in mind that Danticat, like Alvarez, is an immigrant writer. She's, as I said, she left Haiti when she was 12. Alvarez left the Dominican Republic when she was 10, and they are both writing in English. They're both educated in the United States. Like Alvarez, Danticat is very involved with Haiti, especially relief efforts after national disasters. She's still very connected to her family. She goes back and visits. She currently lives in Miami, which has a very thriving Haitian American population. She's also very active in helping with Haitian immigrants who are fleeing oppression. So, you know, she's not, she hasn't forsaken her culture and her country, but I think it's interesting, you know, what happens with these immigrant writers. They're displaced, they're exiled for economic or political reasons, and how do they reconstruct home in their fiction? How is the new home depicted? Because we get a little bit about the United States in here and what it's like to be Haitian American. What's it like to go back to a place that you have left? You know, where is your sense of identity? So I think Savory argues that we're all kind of in exile from, it could be literal in terms of the land, we don't live in the land that we're exiled from, or it could be we're just exiled from our past, our families, whatever. So we can look at it in different ways. But I really did want to take down Danticat, in particular this book, because it is showing the Caribbean as immigrant and exile, and this is a phenomenon of Caribbean writing and the Caribbean experience, and having to you know, deal with, well, I know what it's like to be Haitian in Haiti. I don't have cultural conflict when I'm there, but what happens when I come to the United States? I go to New York, or if I go to London or something like that, then what happens to my Caribbean identity? And we saw some of that in the Giselle Pineau book as well. And I think this does something interesting with, you know, Caribbean writing and location and where you are, etc. So, let's see. Looking over here at my notes, I think this is all right. Oh, I think one last thing too to remember, in the 90s, there were two big cases where Haitian Americans were, I don't know, they were arrested by the New York police and ended up being brutalized. One was Abner Luima in 1997, and I think he was the one who was, I think the officers sodomized him with a wooden stick or a bully club or something like that, which is not, of course, what most officers do. And then Patrick Dorsemond, who I think was shot in the back. I'm not sure. So I think that at some point some of the characters in New York are listening to police reports or news reports about these things happening. So that's also happening in the background as well. So the violence isn't unique to Haiti. So I hope that you do really enjoy this book. I think a nice thing that Danticat does here as well is that she gives a human face to a place that we oftentimes just see in terms of suffering, deprivation, bad news. As I've said before, I think the media really does focus on negative stories in general about anywhere. I mean, if you turn on the Charlotte news, it's always just a string of unfortunate events. Usually a lot of people driving into houses, which is odd. But anyway, you know, the media likes to focus on these traumatic, violent stories, whether it's at home or abroad. But it's unfortunate when all we hear about abroad are just bad things, natural disasters, illnesses, civil unrest, violence, etc. That's all we get. We don't get the human face, and we don't get. I don't know, that there are still more good people than bad people, and I think that's why I like Danticat's focus on compassion and empathy and having understanding even for people who do bad things. And her focus is always on, you know, we're more complex than this, and also, you know, we're more interesting and we're better than just these stories of violence. I think stories of endurance and survival are very inspiring to us, because we all have to KBO, as Winston Churchill said. You got to keep buggering on and keep going from day to day. So, anyways, this was quite a long video. I hope that it was helpful. I hope that you are all having safe travels if you are out there traveling, and if you have guests, I hope you're surviving your guests. And let me know if you have any questions.